You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, for years now, especially this year, we've heard a steady drumbeat of rhetoric from Democrats in Virginia about gun violence. And I wanted to point out something to the public that this morning in a House subcommittee, there was a bill addressing gun violence, very specifically addressing gun violence, and gun violence that is committed by some pretty bad people. This bill would, Madam Speaker, have increased the penalties for the use of, and I'm reading from the bill, any pistol, shotgun, rifle, or other firearm, or display such weapon in a threatening manner in the commission of or attempting to commit the following crimes: murder, rape, forcible sodomy, inanimate or animate object sexual penetration, robbery, carjacking, burglary, malicious wounding, and aggravated malicious wounding. That bill was summarily defeated in the Public Safety Subcommittee this morning, Madam Speaker. A bill that, despite all of the calls for addressing gun violence that is aimed specifically at people committing violence with a gun, was killed in short order. Madam Speaker, I'm sure as the session progresses and we see the various agendas associated with how we treat criminals versus how we treat law-abiding citizens who only choose to arm themselves for very legitimate and lawful purposes. As we see those agendas progress, I'm sure we're going to see more things like this, where the calls for stopping gun violence really ring hollow, because when someone actually commits gun violence in the Commonwealth of Virginia, it would seem that we don't really want to address that, or that House Democrats don't really want to address that. And I think it's important that people see this emerging agenda, that they see when gun violence is aimed at criminals, that it apparently is not part of the agenda pending here. But when law-abiding people, where there's little nexus between their behavior and how they live their lives and how they choose to arm themselves, and the bills that are now pending before the legislature in terms of what they hope to achieve. I just think we're going to see more of that, Madam Speaker, and I regret that, and I hate that, and I wonder if truly stopping gun violence is the objective of the bills now pending before the legislature, if we're going to kill bills that actually do just that. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Delegate from Fauquier, Delegate Weber.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise for a point of personal privilege.
Delegate Weber, do you have the floor?
Thank you. Yesterday, 22,000 Second Amendment supporters visited our Capitol. The majority of them were well armed, they were polite, they were orderly, they were peaceful. 16,000 people outside the fence. None of them was arrested for violence. When they left, they picked up their trash and generally cleaned up after themselves. This was a remarkable exercise in democracy that we all should be proud of. This is the Second Amendment community in Virginia and our nation. All colors, all creeds. They obeyed the laws and rules laid out before them. When the majority and the governor threw them curveballs by changing the rules, they obeyed them. Not one weapon was confiscated at the metal detectors. Those who were armed stayed outside the secure area. They came to lobby and were respectful and polite. I don't know what else our constituents can do to show they're trustworthy. They obey the law and they handle their firearms responsibly. We have seen this demonstrated at hundreds of gatherings across the Commonwealth without a single incident of violence. These are the same people that the majority seeks to disarm. As we saw with a series of votes in the committee this morning, the majority is far more interested in punishing the same law-abiding Virginians than they are in punishing criminals. Just this morning, the majority killed a bill that would have increased the penalty for committing a felony with a gun. There are millions of firearms in the Commonwealth, owned by millions of Virginians. I understand that some of our colleagues are afraid of firearms. They're foreign to them. They didn't grow up around them, and they don't understand them. I get that. But Madam Speaker, I hope the majority will learn from yesterday. 22,000 of our friends, neighbors, family, and co-workers, and nothing happened. The media predicted chaos. Some of our colleagues said they feared for their lives from these people. Madam Speaker, I would suggest that perhaps the majority has misjudged these people, our fellow Virginians. I hope that they will consider that as we go forward and consider legislation that would take away their Second Amendment rights in the near future. Thank you.
The delegate from Montgomery, Delegate Hearst.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise for a point of personal privilege.
Delegate Hearst, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen of the House, I just don't understand how the delegate from Fauquier could possibly say that these crowds show the true will of the people of Virginia. Because it's not the thousands of armed and masked men outside the Capitol we should be paying attention to assess the mandate of the voting public. It is the makeup of this current body and the one down the hall. So take a look at the 100 or so of us gathered here on the House floor. We had elections in November that represented the true will of the people. And that number of voters is far higher than any masses gathered on Main Street or Franklin Street. 2,388,213 voters in November. And those who want action on gun violence to save lives voted in larger numbers than those who want the status quo. Now, for years, a day honoring the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has been co-opted by a minority of angry and determined instigators seeking to distract from his unique and profound legacy. And yet we, on this side of the aisle, have persisted. We lean on his words from his letter from a Birmingham jail when he said, quote, "We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed." And for years now, we have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every black person with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see with one of our distinguished jurists that justice too long delayed is justice denied, because there comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over and men are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of despair. I hope you, sirs, can understand our legitimate and unavoidable impatience. And that despair has extended to those who demand action on gun violence to save Virginian lives and the lives of our fellow Americans. And we have been impatient for far too long. But that persistence is about to be remedied. For 13 years, the town of Blacksburg and the community of Virginia Tech have been impatiently waiting for action. The shooter of the 2007 massacre had a teacher who tried to raise the alarm of impending trouble. Her name is Lucinda Roy. She wrote a book that I revisit often. It's titled, "No Right to Remain Silent." The implication being that when you are in that abyss of despair, Madam Speaker, you must not stay quiet, but instead persistently speak out until that change occurs. She writes, "Once there was a small town in Southwest Virginia, one of the most beautiful places in the world. Then one day, a terrible thing happened. And afterwards, we said to each other, as people do, how could this ugliness have happened here to us, knowing it would have been easier to bear had it happened somewhere else to other people? And the lucky ones who weren't in that location said, how could this ugliness have happened over there to them? But in their hearts, even the lucky people knew that this unfortunate question belonged to them as well. Because what happened over there could happen anywhere. Because we are always they in the end." But this was a large, uncomfortable thought which took up too much room in a world that is always chronically preoccupied. Better to remain silent. People whispered, afraid of attorneys, afraid of the media, afraid of jeopardizing the rights they treasured, afraid of what it would cost. So the thing just floated in the air, an ugly hook of a question waiting for something to snag upon it. It hooked other questions so that soon there was a series of them hovering in the air above our heads. And people, when they looked up, saw a necklace of sorts, Madam Speaker. You could say a noose. Personally, Madam Speaker, the cause that partially brought me to this hallowed chamber The death of a great love now has come full circle. I am happy and madly in love again. And would you believe it, after years of questioning my faith, she has brought me back into the church. And Sunday morning, our pastor's sermon included a parable Jesus told in Luke chapter 18, the parable of the persistent widow. He said, in a certain town, there was a judge who neither feared God nor cared what people thought. And sometimes members of this body are accused of the same. And there was a widow in that town who kept coming to him with the plea, grant me justice against my adversary. For some time he refused, but he finally said to himself, even though I don't fear God or care what people think, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will seek that she gets justice so that she won't eventually come and attack me. And the Lord said, listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? I tell you, he will see that they get justice, and quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on this earth? So when we see the thousands of people outside, many of whom aren't even citizens of this great commonwealth, and speaking to the point about blown up or manufactured dangers, I can tell you that when you go to the message boards for white nationalists and white supremacists, when you see now that they are being date and time specific and wanting to shed blood in order to try and start either a civil war or a race war, all of the concerns made by this body and by Capitol Police and by the governor's administration were incredibly well-founded. Not for the majority of the tens of thousands who showed up, but for a particular sect who are bent on trying to start trouble, and thank God nothing bad happened. I would completely reject the notion that we were over-prepared or overanalyzed or overstated what could have happened yesterday, and I thank my Maker above that we all are back here peacefully once again. But when we still see these thousands of people outside, I still have faith. We have faith. We remain persistent because there is a silent majority that did not show up on the Capitol grounds yesterday because bullies have made our sacred space temporarily unsafe. That majority is millions of Virginians who remain persistent and desperately want to keep their faith in us. And to them I say, don't worry. That faith will be fulfilled because we will not be deterred in our mission to save lives. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Delegate from Virginia Beach, Delegate Davis.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise for a point of personal privilege.
Delegate Davis, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Rally turns raucous. Small group of protesters broke off from a larger group and blew by cops on the steps, and others joined in. 31 arrests. No, that wasn't yesterday. That was a headline, March 3rd, 2012, on an article regarding an abortion rights protest of under 1,000 participants. In contrast, yesterday, 22,000 citizens lobbying for the protection of their Second Amendment rights and the ability to protect themselves and their loved ones came together. No reported instances of overtaking Capitol Police, only one arrest of someone that wasn't even affiliated with the protection of Second Amendment rights. The 2012 protesters, it was a peaceful protest of citizens. But yesterday, the attendees were referred to in many cases using blanket statements like activists, white nationalists, militia members, I guess in today, bullies. But who I saw out there yesterday, who I talked to, NASA engineers, fast food employees, female competitive shooters, lawyers, doctors, retired law enforcement, and our U.S. veterans. Individuals that have never participated in politics before until their Second Amendment rights were deemed in threat. But they get referred to as extremists. But interestingly, what doesn't get referred to as extreme? A comment by a congressman suggesting that the governor may need to use the National Guard to enforce a gun ban. banning pistols used in many shooting sports competitively across the nation, banning items like muzzle brakes, whose sole purpose is to decrease recoil, thereby decreasing the potential for firearm accidents, and banning shooting ranges specializing in the education and practice of safe firearm use doesn't seem to be considered extreme by this body. So, Madam Speaker, I'd like to express my appreciation for the truly peaceful act of assembly demonstrated by those in support of their Second Amendment rights yesterday, and apologize for any hypocrisy that one of them may have felt. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The delegate from Fairfax, Delegate Samira.
Madam Speaker, I rise for a point of personal privilege.
Delegate Samira, you have the floor.
Madam Speaker, what would the Reverend do in our Capitol if he were alive yesterday? Many thoughts come to mind, but the theme was clear to me. Martin Luther King Jr. would be in the Capitol, standing tall, demanding justice for all. He would be on the front line of the battle against systemic poverty, regardless of the obstacles. The Reverend was always at risk of getting killed. Violence against black civil rights activists, leaders, has always been deadly. Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, better known as Malcolm X, was murdered by gunfire in 1965. Martin Luther King Jr. was gunned down in 1968. Yesterday, the demonstrations attracted the attention of neo-Nazis, alt-right trolls, white supremacists, and other racist fringe extremists who view guns as an absolute need to advance their violent agenda. They abuse the intent of the Second Amendment. It's clear that white supremacy is on the rise here in Virginia, the U.S., and globally. Data shows that white nationalist propaganda, demonstrations, and violence have all increased at dangerous rates since 2015. The man who took 50 Muslim lives in Christchurch produced a manifesto dripping with white supremacist ideology that connected directly to the U.S.'s white supremacist movement. His rhetoric mirrored the radicalizing language found on racist message boards and neo-Nazi sites across the internet. The same language shut down Charlottesville schools for 2 days earlier last year. What has many of us most agitated is not the fringe elements, intimidation tactics, but the fact that these fringe armed demonstrators have hijacked such an important day. The one day a year when we are to thoroughly reflect on the legacy of the great Martin Luther King Jr. Truly, MLK would agree that the fringe activists were only distracting from his core message about justice, poverty, and universal human value. So I want to recommit this legislative body to that message and remind us all what should really be on our minds. The existence of poverty in the U.S. should not be accepted as a necessary evil or insoluble problem, but should be considered a crisis requiring emergency measures. It is a matter of will and priorities, not a matter of resources, Martin Luther King Jr. said. MLK understood that a message of racial justice does not include economic justice is not a message of racial justice at all. He knew that progressivism is an empty promise if it does not address what he called the three evils of racism, poverty, and militarism. Indeed, we can go from issue to issue, whether it's healthcare, housing, education, climate change, wages, job quality, or criminal justice, and see that there's an economic and political power structure in place that entrenches the disparities between well-off Virginians and those who are continually left behind by the system. When MLK says that eradicating poverty is a matter of will and priorities, not a matter of resources, he's saying that these economic and political power structures cannot be disrupted without the will and courage to change the status quo, or as we call it in the Commonwealth, the Virginia way. When he says that eradicating poverty is a matter of will and priorities, not a matter of resources, he's saying that when we live in the best state for business and the most economically successful nation in human history, we shouldn't believe anyone who tells us that we don't have the tools or resources necessary to lift up all marginalized people. This session, I have introduced new bills that I believe will go a long way in serving the goals laid out by MLK, specifically in the areas of housing and healthcare. However, their fate in this legislative body is to be determined because in institutions like ours, the entrenched powers that can be override any attempts at progress. So here's my challenge to everyone here today. And to all Virginians who are working earnestly to make this Commonwealth a better place for all, do we have the courage to make good on MLK's mission? Do we have the courage to take the necessary steps for our constituents, even when it is politically hard? Do we have the courage to recognize the totality of MLK's message for the world, or will we revert back to the safe retelling of history that allows us to hold up MLK's legacy while the issues he raised over 50 years ago remain unchecked? I believe that we can be compassionate, and I know that now is the time to get it done. Thank you, Madam Speaker.